Hello and good evening. I'm Ramesh Ramachandran and you're watching Gravitas, where we'll delve into the day's headlines and get you perspectives on the issue. On the big discussions this evening, Trump hardens rules for deportation of illegal immigrants. Another related issue is the move by Trump to make it difficult for skilled workers to live and work in the US. We discuss the impact and implications for India and the world. But first, news about Foreign Secretary Subramaniam Jaishankar's visit to China. What are the big takeaways from his visit? Are the two countries any closer than before to resolving some of their outstanding bilateral issues? We at WION have been closely following the visit and the contours of his visit. But before I throw it open for discussion, first I want to walk you through some points that should give you a flavor of what all the two sides discussed. To begin with, this was the first round of what is now described as a restructured strategic dialogue between India and China. Jaishankar held talks yesterday with Chinese State Councillor Yang Jiechi and today first with Foreign Minister Wang Yi, followed by a 5-hour-long discussion with his Chinese counterpart, Executive Vice Foreign Minister Zhang Yesui. Also, Indian officials accompanying Jaishankar held separate discussions with Chinese officials on issues such as Afghanistan, counter-terrorism and nuclear cooperation. As Jaishankar told the media towards the end of his visit, and I quote, "There were areas where we forged ahead, particularly on the bilateral side, where we worked on the calendar of activities and priorities for us to share," unquote. And yes, he did raise the outstanding issues of China blocking a United Nations ban on Pakistani terrorist Masood Azhar and China's opposition to India's membership of the nuclear suppliers group. But importantly, is China amenable or willing to revisit or reconsider some of its positions on those issues? Not, at least on the face of it. As Jaishankar himself put it, and again I quote, "On the NSG issue, the Chinese side underlined that they were open to India's application for membership, but they had their view of procedures and processes, and these were somewhat different from where we are at the moment and where we think most of the group is at the moment," unquote. All right, to discuss all this and more, we are joined now by Professor Saran Singh, School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, who joins us via Skype from Colombo. Also joining us soon will be Brahma Chelani, author and expert on strategic affairs. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us on this discussion tonight on Gravitas. Coming to you, Professor Singh, there we ran through some of the highlights of Jaishankar's remarks after his conclusion of his visit. In your estimation, what could be some of the biggest takeaways or outcomes, as it were, from this visit?
China-India relations, as we all know, are fairly complex, and one should not expect any big takeaways from any such meetings. But if we have to look at big takeaways, I will give you 2 or 3. One, that after almost 3 years, this is the first time that we have revived the strategic dialogue, and we are calling it restructured. I'm not sure if it is restructured from the Indian side, but it looks like the Chinese side has restructured it, because you're now talking to an executive senior vice foreign minister, who incidentally is also the chair of the CPP, Communist Party's Committee on the Foreign Affairs Ministry. So in that sense, that person is perhaps relatively more powerful. They have also added this time their top negotiator for nuclear issues, Wang Chuan. That is another addition from their side. So the fact that the negotiations on strategic dialogue have reappeared after nearly 3 years is a good achievement. Even the special representatives have not met almost for a year. They last met in April last year. So the beginning is good. Second takeaway, I think, to see here is that because Jaishankar has spent one of the longest time in Beijing as an ambassador, almost 4.5 years, he has a good personal chemistry. So as you mentioned in your earlier report, he managed to meet Yang Jiechi, who is the state councillor and senior most person, who's also special representative. Then today morning he met Wang Yi, who's the foreign minister. And of course, a long marathon 5-hour negotiations. So I think the whole range of people he met. And finally, I think if you look at what are the insinuations one can draw from small comments one is hearing, he mentioned that China-India relations are moving now from bilateral to multilateral. And he mentioned specifically that China and India work together in Shanghai Cooperation Organization, East Asia Summit, BRICS, G20, and then interesting take he gave us, saying that we could have more common understandings on more issues. That if NSG is an area where China can make concession to us, maybe we will tomorrow make concession in other multilateral forums. Mention of bilateral cooperation in nuclear issues and counterinsurgency. So maybe we are talking of whether China can potentially export their AP1000 reactors to India, because Westinghouse reactors are now not becoming a possibility. So these are, I think, apparently a very warm and important beginnings that Jaishankar has made as Foreign Secretary of India. But of course, we will soon follow other details as to what rest, comes out of these negotiations, which is a good beginning to start with.
Indeed, Professor Singh. Now, I have the transcript of Foreign Secretary Jaishankar's remarks. And before I ask you to parse some of his remarks made there in Beijing earlier today, I want to go back to a comment which you made yesterday here on Gravitas, where you said that you are hopeful, or hoping at least, that India would engage in imaginative diplomacy going forward. Now, I want to ask you, did you see any sign of it today?
Obviously, those innovative and imaginative issues where India is maneuvering its positions will not come into public very soon. But I really assume that something must have conspired or transpired on China-Pakistan economic corridor as to what is India's view on it and how India looks at it. And also on NSG and counter-terrorism has been openly mentioned, of course. And we have said that India is looking forward to sustain that dialogue. That has come out repeatedly, that India is not in a hurry, but wants to really persist with engaging in dialogue with China. So apparently, we are showing our commitment that we will sustain this dialogue and keep it at high level. We have about 30 similar mechanisms between two countries. So I think this is at the top right now. But, there are things moving in several other mechanisms simultaneously. I think that also could be potentially important, that maybe we are focusing too much on strategic dialogue, but movement may be happening elsewhere.
Right. Also, Professor Singh, now we saw and heard the Foreign Secretary raise the twin issues of India's quest for NSG membership and also a UN ban on Masood Azhar. Now, before I pose you the next question, I just want to quickly read out what the Foreign Secretary said. He said on the NSG issue, the Chinese side underlined that they were open to India's application, but they had their view of procedures and processes. And these were somewhat different from where we are at the moment. Given China's effort to preempt India taking up these issues, do you think the Chinese response was pro forma, and were you at all surprised by the Chinese reluctance to relent on some of these positions?
We have to be really very careful in reading the semantics the Chinese use.
Right.
For example, before the meeting, they've been talking about India not providing any solid evidence in this case. To now, conversation about procedures. This obviously is a movement from the Chinese side, that they are not willing to say we have no credentials, but they are willing to say we will engage you in talks about this. They are still delaying the whole process, but from the Chinese side, this could be read as a step forward, movement from saying absolutely no evidence which we see to saying that we are willing to look through procedures, which is what broadly they have been saying. So it's not a big change, but it's a very, very minor change in their speaking about issue of putting Azhar Masood on the sanctions list.
Right. So are you therefore suggesting that there is some forward or incremental movement forward or progress on the NSG issue? Is that, have I understood it correctly?
No, I'm saying on the issue of putting the name of Azhar Masood on the sanctions list, the change of language of talking of procedures, and same is true of NSG also.
Okay.
And Chinese have been talking about evolving a general criterion. Apparently, that is not being mentioned now. They have treated India as a non-NPT signatory and saying that for all such countries that have not signed NPT, we need to really build a general criterion. So from that language to shifting to talking about building procedures and processes is a shift. I mean, whether it is a forward shift or it is a sideways shift, that we'll come to know later, but it is change of language. And I think in Chinese case, change of language is perhaps substantive achievement in one such dialogue.
Absolutely. And touching upon another issue which has been raised by India from time to time in the past, and that's the issue of trade deficit. Now, the Foreign Secretary said that the Joint Economic Group can be expected to meet regularly and at the earliest to review the position. Now, going forward, do you expect China at all to make any overtures towards India to reduce the trade deficit, as it were?
First of all, there are two things we need to understand. One, India has deficit with other countries too. But that does not become a political ping pong ball. So sometimes we make deficit issue politically far more live than we do in other cases. Second, China has similar deficits with every other country, including United States, where it is exporting $400 billion to import only $100 billion. And President Donald Trump has been talking about this. So we are not in a unique position of being victims as if of Chinese onslaught, saying that we have a deficit problem. Many other countries have deficit problem. Now we are stuck with deficit problem partly because in 1990s, we had a very equal trade and we were a unique relationship of India and China having a rather balanced exports and imports. Now we are kind of falling in line with just like normal other countries which invariably have huge deficits while trading with Chinese. We have to find a solution, which is good because otherwise trade is not growing. It is stuck between $65 to $70 billion for about 7-8 years. So if we want to see movement forward, and that is true for both sides, that they have to find some ways and means where India's exports to China can be improved. To some extent, we had a whole scandals case, policy paralysis in the second part of the last government, second tenure of the last government. So partly a lot of the mining was affected and therefore basic things like iron ore that we sent to China as an export got impacted also. So one could also look at domestic explanations, whereas China, why it is that India's exports to China have reduced. But of course, bigger reason lies with the fact that Chinese have not allowed us to really facilitate our exports to China. They have not opened up avenues where we want to really push our exports. And that is not good because if the trade is not balanced, it will not grow. And that is what is happening for 7 to 8 years now. I hope some understanding on that subject would also move forward. We had thought of Chinese investment helping because if Chinese are manufacturing in India under Make in India program, then maybe some of the imports from China would come down. India's exports will become competitive. But now with the 1.5 years of not so happy relationship, even those investments have really slowed down and really not moving forward. So even that alternative, innovative strategy which we were trying to put on apparently is not helping right now. It may again come back and help us in future.
Right. Also, Professor Singh, now there is a view in New Delhi and outside that every time India goes to Beijing or official visits Beijing, we go with a long list of our concerns, grievances, demands, and but the Chinese always act or react imperiously. They don't seem to be willing to give India satisfaction on any of our concerns. Now, the question is, if India wants China to relent on some of these issues, in your estimation, what should India do or say differently?
I think basically, as I always say, India has to incentivize China's indulgence. And let me say, in some cases, India also maybe appears imperious to some other countries, especially in our neighborhood. So, that's not something, again, very special that in international relations, in diplomatic sort of parleys and negotiations, sometimes there is a sensitivity about one of the two behaving imperious. And United States is a country where half the world blames them to behave imperiously. Fundamentally, we have to get the job done and we have to resolve our issues. Chinese have their own grievances, we have our own grievances. We have to really, indeed, strategic dialogue, speaking from theoretical point of view of diplomacy, is meant actually not to simply show concerns. That is what we do in normal bilateral dialogues. We show concerns on issues. Strategic dialogue, since it is long-term, it has to really explore new grounds. So we have to find out as to which are the new little areas where we have built some common understanding. And ideally speaking, there should be some kind of a joint statement at the end of such strategic dialogue so that other people also get to know as to where they have developed some kind of mutual understanding or common understanding on issues. But I think it will take a little more time than it has just started after nearly 3 years. So, warming up period should be given to such negotiations. Maybe the follow-up strategic dialogues, next one possibly happening in Delhi, should maybe show some results. And we will get to know about these negotiations maybe in a couple of days or a couple of weeks to come.
All right, Professor Singh, I'll request you to stay on. We are now joined by Brahma Chalani on the phone line. Thank you, Mr. Chalani, for joining us on Gravitas tonight. Now, I was discussing with Professor Swaran Singh moments ago about how India should or can respond to China going forward to make it relent on some of these issues, such as the India's quest for membership of NSG or the UN proscription of Masood Azhar. Now, in your estimation, given your vast experience of observing and dealing with India-China affairs, now a question arises, and that is that China does not shy away from employing any and every tool in its arsenal to bring countries around to their point of view. Now, be it coercion, be it whatever tools they can and should have in their armory as such. Talking about India now, what about levers which India can employ vis-a-vis China? For instance, there's been a lot of talk about how India can and must revisit its Tibet policy, or as we saw in the US, Trump talking about not sort of continuing with the one China policy. So, in terms of leverages, Mr. Chalani, how can India do differently or act differently going forward?
India has several tools of leverage against China. Trade is one such instrument. For every $5 of Chinese exports to India, China imports only $1 worth of goods from India. So this is a very lopsided trade relationship that China enjoys with India. It's dumping goods in the Indian market, it's undermining Indian manufacturing, and it's reaping a huge trade surplus, which is now almost $60 billion annually. Now, this is an instrument of leverage that India has vis-a-vis China. Tibet card, of course, is another instrument of leverage that India has.
Right.
But we are not using these instruments of leverage, nor are we making clear our concerns on some of the projects that China is undertaking. For example, in today's strategic dialogue, going by the Foreign Secretary's own briefing to the Indian media after the discussions, he did not mention that he raised this issue of the China-Pakistan economic corridor, which is an infringement of Indian sovereignty. The presence of Chinese troops and personnel in Pakistan-occupied Kashmir is an affront to India. And we have to raise this issue at every meeting and be vocal about it.
Right, absolutely. Since you raised the CPEC issue now, CPEC is just one of many outstanding issues that India has vis-a-vis China. There's the issue of the elephant in the room, as it were, that's Pakistan, China's all-weather ally. We constantly talk about the string of pearls strategy, as it were, how Chinese influence is growing in India's backyard, especially in Sri Lanka, for instance, with the Hambantota port. We also have the outstanding issue of our undemarcated border. And not so long ago, we had another issue of Chinese stapled visas, not to mention the Brahmaputra waters and the border transgressions. Now, on the one hand, we do talk about all of these concerns, but on the other, as you mentioned, there are so many levers which India could employ going forward. But as you said, we don't seem to. Now, why this difference? What do you attribute this difference to? Is it history? Is it geography? Is it psychology? Is it something, all of it? I mean, what's your take, Mr. Chalani?
First, we haven't gotten over the humiliation of 1962. That remains deeply embedded in the Indian psyche. Second, our diplomacy is still not proactive, nor is it willing to recognize that reciprocity is the first principle of diplomacy. Especially in dealing with a country like China, your dealings have to be based on mutual reciprocity and respect. Imagine if China had been in India's place and India had been building a corridor through an internationally disputed area like Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. Imagine the hue and cry Beijing would have made almost daily. Certainly at every meeting with India, they would have raised that issue. but we are shy to raise that issue. I still don't understand how we can actually seek to build leverage vis-a-vis China.
Right.
If we do not raise issues of legitimate concern to us, issues that the international community, for example, will support us, issues like the issue of China, not just shielding Masood Azhar. That's just one individual. The larger issue is that at a time when the rest of the world is trying to exert pressure on Pakistan to snap its links with terrorist groups, China is shielding Pakistan, in a way condoning Pakistan's sponsorship of terrorism.
Right.
And in this larger frame of things, we seem to be just focusing on that minor issue of Masood Azhar. Masood Azhar, if tomorrow China relents on the Masood Azhar issue, and if tomorrow China relents on the issue of India's admission to the nuclear suppliers group, does that change the fundamentals between China and India? No. China will still be engaged in hostile actions against India. So we have to bear in mind that we should look at things in the larger perspective and not carried away by issues of immediate concern. For example, the Masood Azhar case or the NSG case.
Right. Since this government in particular has spoken about a more robust China policy, a more muscular policy, as it were, where neighbors and countries can see eye to eye. Now, given that context and given that background, what would your advice or suggestion be to the Indian diplomats who deal with China on a regular basis? What kind of an out-of-the-box solution or approach can they possibly take vis-a-vis China?
First, I see no sign whatsoever of India pursuing a muscular approach or even a proactive approach toward China. We have to shed timidity. Timidity is very much ingrained in our policy approach, especially vis-a-vis China. And if you remain timid, there is no way you can employ instruments of leverage that you have. There is no way you can actually focus attention on the trade issue.
Right.
China is waging a trade war against India systematically, undermining and killing Indian manufacturing, dumping goods in the Indian market, and enjoying nearly a $60 billion trade surplus annually. In fact, what China is doing, it's subsidizing this China-Pakistan economic corridor through the surplus it enjoys with India in trade.
Right.
That trade surplus of $60 billion is much more, and that's just the annual trade surplus. The total cost of the China-Pakistan economic corridor is about $46 billion, right? So that's not even the surplus that China enjoys in 1 year vis-a-vis India.
Right.
So indirectly, we are subsidizing China's India containment policy and projects.
Fair enough, Mr. Chilani. I want to quickly go back to Professor Singh one last time before we wrap up this segment. Professor Singh, talking about levers and that India could possibly employ. Also, if you could just dwell a little bit on how the India-China relationship could flourish or could move forward under a Trump administration, given the fact that the rhetoric coming out of Washington has not been music to China's ears so far, at least.
I think one issue on which Trump has been consistent, which is very rare, is on China. His focus on China at least should keep the Chinese entangled or busy. Do we have levers? I thought United States...
So does that give India room for maneuver vis-a-vis China, Professor Singh? When you talk about Trump and the new US administration, do you think that would give India room for maneuver?
To the least, if China stays entangled with Donald Trump, it gives us some levers, some space to maneuver. But the biggest India has was United States. And if that United States is looking inwards, then perhaps China would also have space to maneuver and increase its influence.
All right.
And very, very quickly, talking of levers, you should remember that we recently had surgical strikes by India both in Myanmar and Pakistan. So we do have tools, but we should also be able to use them. And we are not able to use against Chinese, as Brahmachalani just said, because China is a veto-holding permanent member of United Nations Security Council.
Right.
It has 4 times bigger economy. It has one-party stability. We have so many parties. We have different parties at states and center. So we have our different kinds of limitations, but we also have strengths. Democracy, for instance, is a great strength of India. And that lever should be used by India very often. But sometimes we cow down. Recently, President for the first time had a meeting with Dalai Lama. That's a lever. But sometimes we track back once we are under pressure from Chinese. We had a delegation of parliamentarians from Taiwan. Good lever. But we again cow down, backtrack. So we use levers, but I think we have to be little more careful in calibrating so that we don't have to retreat from using these levers once we use them.
All right, fair enough. Yeah, your point is well taken, Professor Singh. On that note, I want to thank Professor Swaran Singh and Brahmachalani for joining us on Gravitas tonight. On that note, we take a break on Gravitas. When we return, the next big discussion: Trump hardens rules for deportation of illegal immigrants. Stay tuned to Gravitas.